I'd like to talk about death, freedom, and the afterlife. When we speak of death in polite society and in common conversation, we speak of it in passing, something which happens eventually, but for the time being happens to other people and not to ourselves. Something which, because it is not currently occurring to us, literally, biologically, because we are not in the process of dying, death is therefore not a part of us. But not only is death every bit as much a part of our being as is life, but rather death is what makes us human beings in the first place. The philosopher Martin Heidegger conceived of the subject in a form he called Dasein, or being in the world. This was his means of sort of conflating the traditional subject-object dichotomy by placing the emphasis not necessarily on the subject or the object, but rather the subject's interaction with the objective world. Uh, this essentially, without becoming too convoluted about it, it was his means of understanding what being truly means and how it comes about. And through this process of being in the world, of the subject interacting with the object, this is the means by which consciousness arises and by which meaning arises. Because under this conception, we are thrown into the world to create meaning for ourselves without an inherent, established metaphysical basis. And therefore, it is up to each individual, each finite individual, to create it out of nothing for himself during his time on this earth as a finite, conscious human being. And to essentially attempt to evade death is to evade responsibility. What I mean by this is if we look at the idea of an afterlife, which is essentially an evasion of death, this is what Sartre would call bad faith. It's an attempt to live as something that we are not, to take on qualities that are not inherent to humankind and do not belong to what Heidegger would call being in the world, as something which is utterly of this world, and the same terminology, or very similar terminology, is what Sartre would call being for itself. This act of bad faith is an inauthentic existence. It's a denial of our total freedom to essentially create ourselves and escape responsibility as being absolutely free and having the capacity to completely create our own paradigm and our own meaning as finite human beings. And what the subject who flees from death, who flees his responsibility into the afterlife, essentially attempts to do is to turn himself into an inert object rather than a vibrant subject. An object which has no freedom because it has no contingency. Something like a planet has a necessary cause and proceeds necessarily with each of its effects. And there is no capacity in this planet to act other than it has been designed. The same with any tool, a hammer, a saw, any mechanism that is an object without consciousness, without self-consciousness, and therefore without finitude and without contingency. It is essentially a robotic automation with a predefined essence, as opposed to a contingent and ephemeral subject who creates his own essence and his own meaning. And death is the ultimate fulfillment of our contingent individuation. Death is what makes us finite. It's what makes us individuals. It's what makes us subjective and absolute subjects within this inherently finite world. Because no one else can die in our place It's something which must happen, and it must happen to us. It's what Heidegger calls, it's for this reason he calls it Dasein's own most potentiality for being. It's the moment of truth, ultimately, when we recognize that we not only will die, but are always capable of dying, that we recognize that we are purely contingent and therefore purely free and purely responsible for everything we create as beings in the world, and that being is exactly what we decide it will be. And when we attempt to flee from a recognition of death and into the afterlife, we essentially cease to be truly vibrant subjects, subjective human beings, and become just, as I said, pure robots with no potential to act as we desire, no potentiality whatsoever. There is only predefined necessary causality. Infinity implies causality, and contingency implies freedom. And if you attempt to escape death, you are essentially escaping freedom. You are becoming the height of an inauthentic being. You are trying to escape into what Heidegger calls the they self, as opposed to the authentic self. The they self is when we conceive of death as occurring to other people, as something which others experience, but something which essentially we'll never have to experience because we don't have to die, because we get to go to heaven and we get to live forever, and we don't ever have to not exist. And that is the characteristic of an inert object in space. And that is an evasion of moral responsibility and ontological authenticity, and attempting to live as something which you are not. That is the they self, as opposed to the authentic self. And I think if we would stop and consider for a moment everything that heaven entails, the concept of an afterlife, and the pure ephemeral, and for that reason all the more special, the pure beauty of recognizing finitude and the absolute nature of death, that makes our control over our own lives as we live all the more absolute and beautiful.